Hello and welcome to Verso Live, a new virtual event program to celebrate 50 years of Verso books. All events are streamed live and will be available to watch again after the event has finished via our YouTube channel. Questions and comments can be made via the YouTube chat box. We hope you enjoy the event.
Hello everybody and welcome. I'm really excited to be chairing this event with such distinguished speakers, and I am excited to unpack some of the themes that we've discussed and are really sort of topical in this moment. So I will just introduce, I won't spend too much time on this, but I'll just introduce them both briefly. So we do have Hazel Carby, who is a Professor Emeritus at Yale and has contributed decades of incredible scholarship around the question of race. She's the author of Imperial Intimacies, A Tale of Two Islands, which was selected as one of the books of the year for 2019 by the Times Literary Supplement. And then we also have Priyamvada Gopal, who is a professor in the Faculty of English at the University of Cambridge, where she's also a fellow at Churchill College. She's the author of Insurgent Empire, Anti-Colonial Resistance and British Dissent, and has been a very prominent commentator in recent times around the question of race and questions of empire. And both of these incredible women have been really important to pushing the conversation further on questions of race and empire and their relationships. So what I wanted to do to begin with is to open with this question, which I think is really topical, around the question of whiteness and the way in which we've seen language emerge around whiteness and its relationship to power. And one of the things that I see as a sort of common theme in both of your work is the way in which you both complicate this question of whiteness as simply a unidirectional sort of tool of power, especially through questions of class and also questions of solidarity in your work, Priya. So what I wanted to do was just sort of invite you both to comment on that and see where we can go from there. Either of you can go first. I guess I'll start with Hazel.
Oh, okay. I think when you say complicate the question of whiteness, I can think of my interest in trying to unpack what that term is, what that ideology is in many different ways. I'm very interested in it as a historical category, like any other category of racialization. I think we have to think always historically specifically about what work whiteness may be doing at any one time, what it might mean for people who are, designated as white. And I think perhaps one of the first things to understand about the term as an indication of dominance, racialized dominance, is that it is the unspoken norm. People who are perhaps, who consider themselves white, don't necessarily have to think about this every day because it is the norm of the way they live. And I find in a contemporary moment, at a moment when perhaps many white liberal friends are beginning to think that they would actually like to understand more about the way in which questions of race work, are actually very reluctant to talk about whiteness. They're very reluctant to engage in conversations about what whiteness may mean to them. They're reluctant to perhaps analyze or think very carefully about how whiteness enables their privileged position in society. And I found recently a lot of frustration trying to actually get people to engage with this, with the term, with their implication in these politics of power, which are negotiated through categories of race and class. They seem happier thinking that, oh, what they need to do is to find and discover more about aspects of white suffering, of Black suffering, as Black suffering subject that they want to know more about. But when you try and interrupt that conversation and say, well, let's think about how you actually inhabit a racial category, then I find that the conversation stops. People are either totally bewildered or completely antagonistic, but just don't see the point of engaging in any conversation about whiteness. And that I'm finding is politically a barrier to really being able to ask ourselves, to interrogate an entire realm of what racialization means and how all subjects have been inscribed in these sort of racial categories. It's not just about quote unquote Blackness or brownness or indigeneity or Latinx. And until we can really have this very serious conversation about white privilege, about whiteness, about thinking about white supremacy, even if people think they're very, very liberal, then I think it's a barrier to the extent to which we really, really can expose how the politics of racialization are affecting everybody.
I completely agree. And just sorry, in the way that you were talking about the inability to interrogate how people inhabit whiteness. And Priya, you recently have been on the sort of receiving end of that, because there's a blindness to it in some quarters, but in some quarters, what we've seen in recent years is an emerging sort of rabid defense of it. And in response to your tweet, you experienced, so Priya tweeted, white lives don't matter as white lives. And in response to that, she received terrible sort of trolling and bullying and torment online. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that, but also in the context of what it means to live in a moment where whiteness has sort of entrenched itself as a position to be defended.
Yeah, I mean, everything that Hazel said is exactly right. And I think what that incident taught us, and it's not the only such incident, is that speaking of the position at the top of the structure, i.e. in this case, whiteness, is difficult. Hazel spoke about how difficult it is to get, liberal white friends racialized as white to talk about whiteness. But more generally, there's kind of very contradictory setup, which maybe is not surprising. So on the one hand, I now hesitate before I use the word white, certainly on social media, because it's treated as an outrage, even use the term. Unless you're using it, in a laudatory sense. And really the only way in which you might be allowed to use it is to say, white culture has contributed a great deal to the world. And that is the only context in which I can imagine it not being contentious. But I think the more important thing that's going on in terms of present day politics is we don't often talk, even on the left or in progressive circles, about the identity politics of the majority or the identity politics of a dominant group. So even in progressive circles, we will look at brown or Latinx or Black politics as identity politics. But we won't, for instance, talk about the fact that Trump and in many ways Brexit were identitarian projects, and they did involve identity politics, and it is the unspoken identity politics of the majority. Now, the interesting thing about this is that whiteness can sometimes act as an unspoken symbol of power, but it is also very eager, and this is, I think, very pertinent to our present. There is a way in which whiteness is eager to present itself as the victim. And the assumption is that women and gay people and brown people and Black people have done well by claiming the position of the oppressed. And therefore, whiteness, in order to perpetuate itself, must claim the mantle of the oppressed. And that has led to a very lethal combination, on the one hand, as Hazel says, of whiteness as an unmarked term, an invisible term. It has the privilege of not having to name itself as a marked racialized term. And on the other hand, when it does speak its name, it lays claim to the mantle of victimhood. And that really is Trump's identity politics in a nutshell. It's the identity politics of the racialized majority. And what is absent, and this is why, in a sense, the question of solidarity becomes so fraught, is an understanding that white, Black, brown, Latinx, indigenous, these are all terms that exist in relation to each other. And we can't just be talking about Black oppression or brown marginalization without talking about white supremacy, but also whiteness is the bedrock of racial organization in Western societies. For me, there is a very pertinent personal parallel. And I'm struck by the ways in which I spent most of my years when I was growing up in India and I was going to college there, not thinking about caste. Why? Because I, belong to the caste at the top of the caste hierarchy. So I shared the privilege of whiteness, in a sense, by not having to think about caste. And that's not an option you have the further down the hierarchy you are. And it's really now, because I've been engaging with racial politics, that I have been forced to think about my own caste position and the ways in which I shared that exactly same privilege of not having to think about the unmarked term, which is Brahmin and upper caste dominance in India. So I feel a certain kind of double consciousness. I can see how race works against those at the receiving end of whiteness, but I belong, in a sense, to a social group that exercises exactly that same privilege upon oppressed groups.
It's very interesting.
And could I just add one thing there, because I'm also very interested, Priya, too, in the way in which the label identity politics is wielded against us.
Yeah.
Because we, Black, brown, indigenous, Latinx populations, we're the only ones who, in quote unquote, have like identities and play the game of identity politics. And this is something I've experienced from my entire career, from the moment I actually, went to the welcome party for new faculty for my first ever job at a university here in the United States, and was told immediately, well, the only reason, you have this job is because of, identity politics.
Oh, yeah.
Educational standards are falling now. And I think language is very important here because, conservative forces, the right, white supremacists have in some ways won a battle within language itself by being able to take very real struggles, a long history of struggle for social justice and contemporary struggles for social justice, and replacing the fight for social, political, economic justice with these words, identity politics. And it's actually completely evacuated the causes of which we are fighting, because identity has somehow substituted itself for this question of justice. I think we need to bring back the question of justice absolutely centrally.
Just on that topic, one of the things that I've been trying to sort of work through recently is this question of how we are constantly sort of confronted with the image of the struggles for justice of the 20th century. But people seem to be so far from understanding the politics, the sort of thought of those movements, or even the organizational logics of those movements. And I think that goes some way to explaining, identity, I think, means something different to us contemporarily to what it meant then, where identity was inscribed as a relation to a structure of power. Whereas today, I think people think more of their identities as having a life outside of the sort of relation of power between, for example, blackness and whiteness, or, worker and capital. And I'm just wondering the extent to which that has to do with the recession of the left and the recession of a particular worldview, which sort of puts identity within the context of the broader structures which produce it and enable it, and as something into which people consent, but also something which exists outside of people as well. I don't know if that makes sense. I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
And I think it's important to remember what Stuart Hall used to say here too. That identity is not something that exists in the past to be found, as if somehow there's just an unproblematic, roots theory that we can apply. But he always argued that identity was something in the future to be fought for, to be fought over, to be struggled for. And I think to bring the question of the politics of sort of solidarity here to the center, that this is what we need to inform our current politics with. We need the basis of a politics of solidarity to be able to not just forge a future, but even be able to imagine a future together. And I worry deeply about the loss of this sense of a politics of solidarity in favor of a multiplicity of identities that don't even seem to be able to speak to each other. I know teaching, undergraduates, they have a fear of actually opening their mouths about Indigenous politics, queer politics, or Black politics or white politics or whatever, if they don't feel that somehow they are included under that label. And they don't have an imagining of how important it is to forge a politics of solidarity. So they imagine that somehow they're being, deferential, and you certainly don't want people, speaking for other groups in some incredibly unfeeling and insensitive manner. But at the same time, we want to be able to imagine that a politics of solidarity is possible, is worth fighting for. And I worry that, a current younger generation is somehow feeling so fragmented from the struggles of others that they really need to learn from and ally with, that they just won't, they find that their imaginations are completely stymied in terms of actually imagining what sort of politics they could be part of to forge solidarity.
My experience with undergraduates, I think, has been slightly different, and this might slightly speak to this particular moment in Britain as opposed to the same moment in America. And I'm speaking really only of the last 4 or 5 years, and that would include, of course, the great movement of young people's support for Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party, but also their involvement with things like Extinction Rebellion. And certainly there was a great deal of student solidarity around the university strikes that happened earlier this year. I think that my own sense is that when we return to discussions which point out that nobody occupies a single identity. Nobody has a single identity, and nobody has a purely innocent or a purely criminal position when it comes to structures, and that we all have to think simultaneously both about complicity in oppression as well as being at the receiving end of it. Then the question of solidarity, in a sense, becomes becomes something that everybody has a stake in. And in other words, so with my students, we might discuss, for instance, whiteness as a system, as part of a system of oppression. We will discuss, gender and sexuality and gender assignment and race as, sites of oppression. But we also then, I think, when we turn the conversation to the ways in which everybody is multiple things, and therefore nobody is exempt from the hard work of identifying their complicity in structures, particularly, and I think it would be true for students where you are, Hazel, as well as students here at Cambridge, that are all of our, in a classroom, we are all complicit in a class structure that is profoundly hierarchical, unequal, and oppressive. And so when you bring class, caste, race, gender, sexuality into the same frame of discussion, then it kind of complicates the question of identity, which is how I see the Combahee River Collective as originally having come up with the term identity politics. It was meant to be a politics, as I understand it, of social justice.
Of social justice.
Yeah, and I think that can be brought back in if we don't simply then say, well, we inhabit one or the other identity, that we are multiply part of structures, in ways that are both oppressive and sometimes at the receiving end of oppression.
And I think that's also where it's very important. I mean, the battle to sort of decolonize the curriculum, for example, it's also very important, it seems to me, and I certainly do this in the classroom, is to be very clear about the politics of solidarity in terms of a history of resistance and people working together. But also, as you quite rightly said, certainly at a place like Yale University, is to begin with the extraordinary privileged situation that they're in that institution, and how that institution itself has a long history of relationships with colonialism. I mean, Elihu Yale, who actually sort of Yale is named after, was an Indian colonial officer, and a lot of the incredibly wealthy artifacts that Yale is in possession of were actually ones that he shipped from British colonies, to the US. And so understanding how you can be both imagining yourself as a group which is underserved, has a historical history of being suffering dispossession, but also simultaneously perhaps is being, educated in a very, very privileged site. And so understanding how complex these politics are, I think, is very important. And I also think making people aware of histories in a way that they've become invisible. I was thinking very much, for example, of the city of Minneapolis, those streets where George Floyd was murdered are also, the same streets where the American Indian movement was forged. And so being able to understand African American struggles, American Indian struggles in relation to each other, in relationship to a common history of the legacy of colonialism, settler colonialism, and imperialism is also important, because I think without that history, we don't understand how dispossessed peoples have stood side by side Because I think at the moment we feel so, and quite rightly so oppressed by the resurgence of fascism and the dominance of white supremacy. But we need to be standing up to that side by side, not imagining that any one group of us is fighting these battles alone.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I would add to that also is that I think that, and this I think comes from my work in Insurgent Empire, is realizing also that the practice of solidarity is a difficult practice. So it's not, this very pretty rainbow array of people who can stand shoulder to shoulder without discomfort. It's
right.
difficult work, and it is the American Indian movement and black rights in America don't necessarily, even though they share a history of oppression, don't necessarily have an easy relationship to each other, partly because, of course, of the structure of divide and rule, of the ways in which colonialism, imperialism, settler colonialism relied on pitting oppressed groups against each other. And so I think if we understand that this is a challenge and it's not going to be easy and it is not the work of one day and one night, and that solidarity is a kind of ongoing practice, I think that might make it perhaps something that we can be realistic about and think about, exactly as you say, Hazel, in terms of histories. And one of the things that I always tell my students is that the history of the British Empire is often presented to us as a divisive history. And of course, it's a divisive history. It was meant to be. That is how it operated. But it is also, ironically, the common ground in a British classroom, in an average British classroom. More than 90% of the people in that classroom will have been shaped in one form or the other by the legacies of empire, and therefore engaging with polarizing and difficult legacies together, you can turn the kind of divisive into the common, precisely by saying, well, this is the shared project of creating solidarity with an understanding of history.
I think that aspect of so I came of age, in a sense, in terms of my thinking, etc., in the initial wave of the decolonize the curriculum movements. And one of the things that was really interesting at the time is that it was initially pitted as a sort of epistemic charge against the university, which is to say, what we're taught doesn't match up, not necessarily simply with our experiences, but with, current research on the history of the British Empire, current research, the thinking about whose voices are absent, which movements are absent. I think largely, by and large, the absence of resistance as a thread, which stretches back historically, says something really powerful about what the institution is setting out to do ideologically. And I guess one of the sort of interesting things has been to see in that moment where that sort of charge against the institution was morphed into a charge of the personal injury of not having ourselves reflected in the curriculum, which was then met in many cases with just, putting a few Black authors on reading lists. It's interesting to see how, as consciousness around questions of Black Lives Matter, but also broader consciousness about the history of empire, which have been thrust to the forefront, especially around, emergent struggles, migrant struggles, increasing people's desire to be made aware of these things, that charge isn't so easily manipulated. And one of the things that I've sort of seen in the last few months, especially in this new Black Lives Matter moment, has been a lot of people who are wanting to read more, who are wanting to know more. And this says something to us about, there is a connection between the treatment of identities as silos and an absence in the classroom, both at, primary, secondary and university level, of a history which sort of treats colonial subjects or imperial subjects as agents, and understands the relationship between their resistance and how they were capable of shaping their own sort of conditions within the context of imperialism, which was, and I think that's produced a sort of, the absence of that has produced a sort of defeatism, which I'm hoping that in this moment, as people become sort of more aware of the history of these struggles, as people connect themselves with histories of solidarity, we can sort of break through that. But, I'm certainly for the last few years in my writing been particularly concerned with where this defeatism has emerged from. I don't know if you guys had anything to say.
Can you say a little bit more about the defeatism and how you've experienced it, Annie?
I think the main way, I experience or understand identity politics contemporarily as a form of defeatism. Identity politics which wants to posit that there's no possibility of solidarity. Because I think if you take as a starting point that even other people who share oppression or who are oppressed in similar ways to you can't be transformed to understand your struggle and partake in your struggle, then there is no hope, is there? If you can't move beyond or think beyond this immediate identity, which is now sort of treated as essential to you, then there is no sort of route, right? You can't change the minds of people with power. If you sort of seize power, then the logical endpoint of that is another form of supremacism. And so I think that, we've got a generation who kind of have gotten to a point where it's like, can't, win, so there's no point. And I think that speaks to the question of how we've sort of struggled in a sense to move from a politics of mobilization to, sustained organizing. And so, the last decade or so has been punctuated with these moments and eruptions of mobilization. But the sort of in-between moments, we're not really seeing a sustained kind of organizing. And I've heard countless stories of like organizations set up which just disintegrate under the weight of competing identities. I'll leave it there.
I do wonder though if identities are the issue in and of themselves. I take the point that the ways in which we talk about identity, particularly in the media, particularly in even in kind of university decolonizing discourse, is extremely arid and it's extremely thin. But I guess I see your generation, Annie, in a sense from the outside. And I have to say that compared to the way in which my generation dealt with questions of identity, I do actually see much more understanding of issues about identities not being so simple, about the fact that there is a structure, and the fact that mobilization can't be simply on the basis of one or the other identity. I'm not saying that what you're saying is absent, but I think that the discussion was certainly thinner 20 years ago. Actually, Hazel, in your the Cultures in Babylon, where you talk about the multicultural wars, canon and reconstruction, and in a sense, you paint a sort of similar picture of multiculturalism in academia as a kind of series of identities which don't engage with questions of structure. I think that problem has come back to haunt us, but I see that much more at the level of university managerialism, university administration, than in the discussions that I have with younger people. I do think, for instance, Extinction Rebellion, for instance, was criticized on many legitimate grounds and remains, I think, riddled with challenges. But individual young people I know who are involved with Extinction Rebellion are quite keen to discuss issues of race, of class, of neoliberalism, the kind of middle classness of green activism and so on. Again, these are not kind of perfect examples, but I'm not sure I see the problem so much in young people and identities as I do with a truly horrific media and a truly horrific structure, and which we saw this operate in Britain in recent years, which will spread disinformation and which will come down very, very hard on anything that begins to resemble real resistance. I think we also have to talk about what we're up against. And what we're up against is not so much our defeatism as a deeply vicious structure determined to hold up the status quo.
And that is obviously right, but I also think that the whole question of sort of decolonizing the curriculum, as Annie correctly said, it isn't just about having, littering the syllabus with a few books by people of color, but it really is about launching a profound critique of the way in which we organize knowledge, the way in which knowledge has been organized into quote unquote disciplines, which seem to be natural, whereas in fact they have been historically formed at any, particular time. And so being able to develop a critical mind to the way in which knowledge is organized, the way in which we receive it, the role of social media, what counts as quote unquote, factual or truth or whatever. These are very much at stake today, but they are not unrelated to how some fields of knowledge have seemed to be beyond question. And so I think one of the sort of really critical struggles is both with the way in which traditional fields of knowledge have been organized, but also constantly critiquing how we are also engaging and inventing and new fields of knowledge for ourselves. So I've been obviously deeply involved in questions of racialization and gendered knowledge, particularly Black studies, African American studies. But I think we also have to ask constantly, for example, in African American studies, the extent to which nationalism, that American in African American studies, has actually played a very, very negative role in imagining future solidarities or imagining how we might be able to constantly critique what it is we've been invented. I mean, one of the long-standing struggles I've had is just even with the question of diaspora, because unfortunately too many, fields of African American studies imagine that somehow the experience of Blackness in the United States is then definitive for the rest of the world. Right. And people can't understand why you would even want to talk about colonialism or imperialism or diaspora. So these are understanding that fields of knowledge have to be constantly interrogated, I think is very important. Yeah. But I also think, in terms of thinking about the future, and I'm full of admiration for Extinction Rebellion. I think it's really quite extraordinary. And I have, been involved in these conversations with the environmental movements in general, in terms of thinking about who they represent and who are representative and who are representative voices, etc. But I also think that we can find ways of imagining the future in the past. For example, I've been thinking a lot about the great migration of African Americans in the US, to the north. And if we actually think, especially if we think about a lot of the artwork produced at the time, how is it and how can we start to explore what that historical experience of migration, how can that be mobilized to understand and to, to bring into view the fact that there are, migrant children in concentration camps on the US border? What is it, for example, in African American history that stops a people for whom migration, both forced and voluntary, has been so important to their history? How come that those people are not actually swarming down to the borders and stopping walls being built? How is it that we're not totally organized on behalf not only of migrants on the borders of the US, but also why doesn't African American studies see as absolutely central the struggles of those leaving North Africa in boats in the Mediterranean and being stopped from entering Fortress Europe and dying in those Mediterranean waters? How come those are not our struggles too? This I think is a very important issue. What is our struggles? What are their struggles? What is this our? I want the students and all sorts of political organizations to be interrogating that term all the time. What counts as ours? What counts as theirs? Why are our bodies not at the forefront of their struggles too? I think that's it, and it's really urgent. It's very, very urgent, and it's understanding that these politics are global, not just local.
Definitely, I think there's been a retreat into the national, and that retreat has coincided. So we sort of turn inwards, but there's like a weird kind of internationalism where everyone thinks that like to be in solidarity with, BLM in the US is internationalism, but that frame doesn't sort of move beyond that. And I think, tying that into the question of decolonizing the curriculum, the question of colonization can't be treated as a historical question. It's also a question of why it comes to be that a particular experience of Blackness or a particular experience of oppression comes to dominate our capacity to imagine both the oppression of people contemporarily, but also the possibilities of liberation. And that dynamic, I think, is under or not dressed as much as it should be. I guess one sort of moving into or digging into this question of what is our struggles, we've seen massive protests, not just in the US, but in the UK. In The Guardian, there was a piece which sort of went around showing how in centuries, this is the most geographically widespread protest movement we had in response to the murder of George Floyd and the mobilizations in the US, all in sort of solidarity with the US. And these were organized by, young Black people, but also these were multiracial demonstrations in which people have increasingly become radicalized by the use of police violence against them and tactics of suppression. And I just wonder, are we in a moment where we can move beyond the ours and theirs? Are we in a moment where we can move towards more of a consolidated we, which accepts that, while solidarity may be difficult at times, there are struggles which are also human struggles.
Can I just come in on that, Annie? It's funny, this might be a slightly eccentric angle to come at it from, but when in India, upper caste Indians started becoming involved in Black Lives Matter and tweeting, BLM hashtags, one of the questions that they were rightly asked is, why is it you have never put a hashtag Dalit Lives Matter or Muslim Lives Matter? So in a funny way, it was quite easy for them to step out of the frame of the national, not take responsibility for what was happening under the name of the supposedly decolonized Indian nation state, and to very conveniently ally themselves in a sort of chic way with Black Lives Matter, because, no skin off their nose, they can put the hashtag without any real sense of complicity, without even addressing South Asian and Indian anti-Blackness or colorism. So absolutely, I think the question of opening up the we to merge into an our is important, but equally, I think it's quite important to also that people understand their specific complicities in specific structures of oppression, so that you don't just become an our in an easy kind of way, that your solidarity as an upper caste Indian for George Floyd must acknowledge that a number of Dalits and Muslims have been lynched. I mean, literally lynched, hanging from trees in the last few years. And that there is no way in which you can transcend your position and jump to the global without having gone through an accounting of the particular and the national. So, I mean, I think the national has always been a poisoned chalice for anti-colonialism, for decolonization, because, of course, the nation form is what anti-colonialists and decolonizers embraced. And we now can see, and in fact, they saw even then what a poisoned chalice it was. So the question now is, how do you account for the specifics of where you are and the structures that you are complicit in or are involved with, without kind of writing out those specificities, but not retreating, as you said, into the national? And the example of African Americanness and its Americanness, I think, is extremely important. So again, coming to the global is a process of work that means that you do also have to take accounting of where you are and what is going on there, and its relationship and resonances with other struggles.
And I think that's absolutely right. And it gets back to your question that it causes a lot of discomfort. And I don't think we can shy away from that discomfort of asking those awkward questions.
I agree. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to start trying to sort of weave in some of the questions we've gotten from the audience.
Annie, before you do that, can I just make one sort of small point about the national? One of the things that troubles me about decolonize the curriculum, I'm trying to write about this right now, and it's a bit of a struggle. I think that there is a funny way in which when we say things like decolonize the university or decolonize the curriculum, the assumption is that we can move from point A to point C. And we go through stage B and we will have arrived at a decolonized future. And that's often, for me, embodied in the term that people throw around quite carelessly, the decolonial, right? So you have a decolonial syllabus, or you have a decolonial university. I think the point, and this goes back to discomfort and it goes back to nationalism, is that decolonization has to be seen as a process. And it is a process that formerly colonized nations have not really undertaken, except in the most minimal nationalist ways. Decolonization has not happened anywhere, and that we do understand, and I think Hazel suggested this earlier, that it's a process and it's ongoing, and there isn't really ever going to be a place where we stop interrogating and then can retreat into the confines of a decolonized university or a decolonized discipline. It is ongoing work, and that is the job of the university, in a sense, is to do this ongoing work.
Definitely. One of the things I've spotted this question about Arundhati Roy, which says she refers to an alarming shift in which the reduced, fragile discourse of human rights is replacing the magnificent concept of justice. I want to add a little bit to that question, because one of the things that we do hear chanted a lot is justice for X at the moment. And I sort of wanted to see if we could take a moment to sort of unpack what that justice means. If, for example, BLM demonstration demanding justice for George Floyd, which requires or is demanding of the state the use of the castle state against the police officers who killed him. So just thinking about that dynamic of human rights alongside the dynamic of justice re-emerging in this moment in a very different way to how it was described and used in the 20th century. I don't know if that spurs anything. Either of you can jump in.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that the discourse of human rights, the way in which it operates, runs the danger of being vitiated, of being attenuated, and being a kind of political football. And it doesn't have the richness and the texture of justice. That said, I'm actually not entirely willing to say, well, never mind human rights, let's just talk about justice. One of the things about human rights is that it was actually, in some sense, the establishment's, the response to anti-colonial struggles, to insurgencies. And it's often treated, and you'll see this in post-colonial contexts over and over again. Oh, human rights is a Western concept. It doesn't apply to us in India or Turkey or wherever. And I'm equally alert to that discourse. If on the one hand we need to be worried about how human rights is being kind of made into a very thin concept that doesn't have the richness of justice, equally, I think it becomes very convenient for the powers that be in post-colonial context to say, well, that's just a Western concept. It doesn't apply to us here. I think we need a thicker, richer, mobile, more and more universal understanding of human rights. And I do think that all struggles for justice do make use of the fact that human rights are consistently violated by states, state actors, and corporations. Whether that's the human right to a family life, or to freedom from hunger, or to freedom from violence. I do think that we need to be cognizant of the ways in which human rights really depends on how you use it and who uses it. And I don't think it's incompatible with justice in and of itself.
No, and I think we can't. I think we can't forget how struggles for human rights have played very important roles, particularly, for example, for indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
In their appeals beyond the national to something like the UN. Yeah. And I think perhaps the way to understand these struggles for human rights is both sort of particular, but also understanding in terms of the process that it isn't the end of the fight for justice. It may be for particular peoples at a certain time extremely important for them to be able to mobilize what has often been a sort of a legal presence that they've been able to wield against states. But the struggle for justice doesn't stop there. It is often one stage in a wider struggle. So, like Priya, I think we have to understand the way in which the human rights struggles have been both necessary for certain groups at certain times, but also not sufficient for us to imagine that somehow then we're going to achieve, justice or solidarity for all. So I think that's what I'd say, necessary, but not necessarily sufficient. I mean, what's very interesting in terms of the development of that is those indigenous peoples who are now actually struggling for rights for nature, both in a sort of, in a number of very, very sort of important legal battles, but also in terms of the battle against extractivism. Because when we are thinking about any sort of future for the human race at all, then we have to actually recognize the very important struggles that actually indigenous peoples are in solidarity with each other around the world are fighting against extractivism. And it seems to me that, one of the important aspects of decolonization is also decolonizing the minds of the North against the South, and actually perhaps listening for these voices of these people who are launching extraordinary battles on the front lines to actually save us all, humanity, the planet, diversity. I mean, being at the front lines of the struggle against extractivism of all sorts. So I think, you know, this sort of question of human rights and who have actually been fighting these battles is a very complicated one, but I don't think we should sheer away from complication. But I do think that we should maybe understand that, you know, the privileges of the North are sometimes actually also making us blind to the way in which these battles are being fought by people from the global South.
Thank you so much. Okay, so the next question, slightly self-interestedly, is a question which says, what does solidarity look like in practice?
Okay, well, the short answer perhaps is that it involves understanding that struggles are linked, that you cannot have, for instance, gender equality without having race equality or caste equality, or that you cannot have sexual emancipation without addressing class structures. And so I think at a very fundamental level, it involves understanding that, and I think perhaps this goes back to your point earlier, Annie, about siloed identities, that there are no siloed identities, that my struggle, let us say, for gender or racial equality is intimately linked up to another person's struggle against caste or against environmental depredation. And I do think, and I was really struck again when I was working on the book about the extent to which people struggling for justice, trying to create transnational alliances, understood struggles to be interlinked and understood that they could not be emancipated without the emancipation of other people, and that therefore it is a responsibility when you're fighting for your own emancipation to also partake of other people's struggles for their emancipation. That's the kind of short answer.
I couldn't agree more.
Sure. And one video came to mind when I saw that question, which is why I asked it slightly self-interestedly. It's a video, it's a clip on YouTube of Bobby Lee from the Black Panthers speaking to the young patriots who would go on to join the Rainbow Coalition in Chicago. And these are people who had the Confederate flag as their logo. They put it on berets and put it on their trousers, and then eventually they decided to get rid of it out of respect for the Panthers. And what was so striking is that, you know, when we begin, it sort of taught me, when you begin from the position of identity of what is mine, there are two routes it can take you. It can either take you further into that particularity, or, and I think this is what the video shows, just by asking these people who would instinctively seem like opposition, what really is going on in their lives. I mean, we don't know so much about people who we think of as like other to us. Yeah. And as soon as they start talking about housing problems, about problems of police brutality that they're experiencing as poor whites, it becomes clear that a lot of what we're experiencing is not just tied, but also the same. And a lot of the way in which we're oppressed is under the same structure. And I think that articulation in the 60s of a global struggle with particular locations to that struggle, or particular sort of points of connection, or, you know, fused, or like points at which that struggle is sparked, is something that is lost today, which I'm hoping we can recover. They used to say, what was it? You can't fight a war abroad about Vietnam. You can't fight a war abroad if you're fighting a civil war at home. You know, it's the same structure. It articulates itself in loads of different ways. And out of that, all of these identities emerge, but that shouldn't take us aside from understanding that relationship or that structure. I don't know. Yeah.
Beautifully put.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to see if there are any other. I know we're running out of time. So we've got one question I think is a good way to sort of finish on the question of mainstreaming of anti-racist struggles. It says, how has the relative mainstreaming of anti-racist and abolitionist movements affected, I guess I'll add to that, the possibilities, but also our capabilities in terms of how we think about and how we organize in that regard?
I wish anti-racism was mainstreamed. If only.
Yeah. I mean, that was my response as well. I mean, I guess the point is that perhaps, I don't know, that BLM in recent weeks has had much more attention than you might have expected. But I don't think it's anywhere near mainstream. I mean, if you, as Annie was saying at the beginning, just go on social media and try to say something about BLM. Or anti-racism, or God forbid, whiteness. And you will see that this is nowhere near mainstreaming. That said, I get the tenor of the question is, when something becomes mainstream, does it lose its radical edge? And that is something we have to be alert for. So again, going back to decolonizing the curriculum, I don't think we can say, well, if we hire a couple of Black people and we put in a little bit more Asian or Latinx literature in our curriculum, then we have decolonized. We have to be attentive to tokenism and a kind of liberal smoothing of the edges. But I don't think we're there yet, certainly with regard to anti-racism. We do need to be careful about the ways in which anti-racism is turned into diversity. Diversity is really very easy, but it's not the same thing as anti-racism. Diversity may be slowly mainstreaming, not really, but getting there. I'm not sure anti-racism is anywhere near the mainstream. Hazel, I don't know.
I certainly don't think it's institutionalized.
Yeah.
I certainly don't think it's institutionalized, but I will say, there are moments of hope. And I must, when you actually think about the way protests have been met over here, horror story, by bringing out federal troops, not in their uniforms, unidentified, against citizens, and then thinking about the response to that, of the wall of mothers, the wall of grandmothers, the absolute refusal to cave in to that extraordinarily authoritarian fascist use of the state. Gave me a lot of that was a politics of solidarity being enacted on the streets right there. But it was, people were putting their lives on the line. People were dying and getting brutalized by tear gas and rubber bullets. But it was an extraordinary act of solidarity to be putting, to see those people putting themselves in front of the Black Lives Matter protesters, or between those Black Lives Matter protesters who were, too often on the front line, but actually putting their bodies between that and these federal troops. That was extraordinary to see, and that was a glimmer of hope in terms of the fascism that we're living through here in the US.
So beautiful. Thank you. And a few things well me up more than solidarity. Well, I guess we've come to the end of our time, unfortunately. We've actually run a little bit over. I insisted to myself that I was going to be a very strict chair, but I think within 5 minutes is good.
Well, thank you, Annie.
Thank you, Annie.
I wanted to thank you both for what was an incredible conversation. There's so much to think with there and to sort of push forward with. after. And I hope that the conversation does continue. Thank you both for joining me this evening and for contributing such amazing thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Priya.
And thank you, Hazel. And also, I think we should thank the organizers at Verso, who've done such a good job of bringing us all together. And thank you. And thanks, Annie and Hazel. It was lovely talking.
And thank you, Ralph, for all the sort of wonderful camera work.
Ralph is our videographer.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.